Want to put questions in the chat, feel free to do so, and that will alert me that you've got questions you'd like to ask. So, Andrew, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for the invitation to address your group. Good evening, friends. I'm really happy to be able to have the chance to talk to you about a subject that's been on my mind and in my actions for 35 years now, since I first went to the region as the FT's correspondent. John made a small mistake, but understandable one, when he said I was FT in Lebanon. I was actually the FT's correspondent in Jerusalem in the Palestinian territories, but that's immaterial. It's simply to be able to say that I have been fortunate to have been able to follow the conflict from different professional hats, as a journalist with the United Nations for many years, with the elders as their policy director, and now in my own professional capacity, and have seen a great deal of change during that 35-year span. Not always change for the better. There has been some up moments and many low moments also. So if you don't mind, I'm going to treat tonight's talk more as a conversation with you, as a conversation as if we were sitting around at the pub together over a nice pint of beer, rather than necessarily a sort of formal talk. I have prepared some remarks and I'm going to draw on them, but I'm also going to ad-lib a little bit. I assume that as people who are concerned about justice for the Palestinians, you follow the issues fairly closely, and I don't have to go into too much background. But what I'd like to try to do is to give you my assessment of where the movement is going, hence the title, and to be able to offer some thoughts as what can be done in future by the Palestinians themselves and by their supporters abroad to try to strengthen their hand and to be able to give them greater credibility, to be able to hold out options for them, even in the face of a very bleak current reality. When the old paradigm of a two-state solution appears almost dead and a new one is yet to be born, to misquote Gramsci. So on that question that I posed for the title, is the movement in a cul-de-sac? I think the short answer is yes and no. So on the positive side, the PLO remains the internationally recognized sole representative of all Palestinian people everywhere. It holds the UN seat, technically as a non-member observer state. Palestine is recognized by over 135 countries, and it's just won an important procedural battle at the International Criminal Court, which decided by a split vote, I should add, that it had jurisdiction over crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories, and that in turn could lead to further consequences, but don't hold your breath. But I would argue that just like the UN General Assembly's own vote to recognize Palestine as a state some years ago, that these are symbolic acts with little or no practical significance. So Palestine can issue letterhead with the name of the state of Palestine on it, but its foreign minister, Riyad al-Malki, can have his Israeli travel permit confiscated on returning from The Hague across the Allenby Bridge, just like a naughty schoolboy, and he has no recourse to it because what the Israelis give, they can take away. And there are no consequences for that. So it's hardly an attribute of statehood when your foreign minister is denied the ability to be able to travel to another city to make his case. I would argue that recognition of Palestine makes a difference in the sense that it provides a moral boost to people and to the leadership at a time when it badly needs it. And arguably, it also changes the legal status of the occupied territories, turning it into an interstate conflict as far as international legal experts are concerned. But in terms of the balance of power, the sheer raw balance of power, it has not made one iota of difference. What has unarguably, I think, reached a dead end is the Oslo process that began in 1995, just over 25 years ago. At the time, the idea of building a state under occupation was a novel and untested one, and an idea that depended entirely on the occupying state's goodwill and on the willingness of external powers, especially the United States and Europe, to put some muscle behind the terms of the Oslo process. I think both of those countries, or political entities, the United States and the European Union, as well as the UK, have failed this test miserably. And to me, I regret to say that it's quite clear from a fairly close reading of the UK's latest foreign policy doctrine that was released a few days ago, the so-called Integrated Review of Foreign Security and Development Policy, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is going to be relegated to being a second order, maybe even third order priority as far as the Johnson government is concerned. Because dealing with Israel on security related issues, high-tech issues, trade, investment is going to be far more important for the UK government, whether I like it or you like it or not. But that is the political line of direction, the direction of travel that we're going in. If I could come back to the status of the PLO, its popular legitimacy among Palestinians, not among UN delegates in New York who don't really have a vote in this matter, is at its lowest ever ebb, and its institutions are completely decrepit. In the refugee camps, nobody pays any attention to the Refugee Affairs Department of the PLO, and they certainly don't to its other structures either, which are held by supernumeraries, people who really should have been pensioned off a long time ago. And unfortunately, the authoritarian and undemocratic behavior of its leadership has really disenchanted a large number of the Palestinian people living in the Palestinian territories and even more abroad who do not identify with it any longer. So it's a paper organization. And 2/3 of Palestinians who've been polled recently in the Palestinian territories want Abbas to stand down after 16 years as president in the upcoming elections. Not that he has given any indication he will heed that opinion poll. The sad truth is, and I've met Abbas on several occasions, if I remember rightly, and he signs photographs which he hands over to me grandly, as if he's a real head of state, is that he's a weather vane blowing in the wind. I mean, especially the wind that comes from Washington in the West. And he will change course and strategy according to what he thinks is going to be likely to go down well in Washington, just as he has done recently, which is precisely why it's called elections for the first time in over 15 years. And as for his other potential supporters or allies in the major Arab states, the governments no longer take the cause seriously. That is a sad truth. The only one that does give any serious attention to it, because it's an existentialist issue for the country, is Jordan. Because if there is no Palestinian state, then the questions of Jordan's viability and Jordan's Palestinian population comes to the fore even more and threatens the situation of the Hashemite family on the throne there. So today the Arab League will continue to give lip service to the cause, but the reality is that there are far more important and pressing issues in the Arab world today. I think the real attitudes that many in the Arab world see today were shown in the really excoriating public attack that Prince Bandar, the former intelligence chief of Saudi Arabia, made on what he considered to be the fecal and corrupt Palestinian leadership a couple of months ago, around the time of the normalization of relations between Israel and several other Arab states. This was, I think, intended to try and prepare Saudi public opinion for an eventual Saudi recognition of Israel and establishment of diplomatic relations rather than the under-the-table attitudes. Now, Saudi Arabia rode back on that a few weeks later when another former Saudi intelligence chief, Prince Turki, I've forgotten his bin Abdulaziz, Turki al-Faisal, excuse me, made a counter speech defending the Palestinians and holding up the importance of the Palestinian cause. And I think that was a recognition that the Saudi public did not like what their leaders were saying. And I think that dichotomy between the continued strong popular support in the Arab world for the Palestinian cause in general, while criticizing the leadership, remains a strong, true fact today. If we look at the attitudes of the younger generation of Palestinians living in the Palestinian today, living in the occupied territories today, a recent survey that was done by one of the best pollsters in the area came up roughly with this conclusion, that about a third of them want to get jobs in the Palestinian Authority. They see it as a patronage system. A third of them want to leave the country, and a third, believe it or not, want to take up arms again, even if that may appear to be very far-fetched and unrealistic as a prospect for where their movement is going. And as the bonds of loyalty to the PLO fray, I fear that some, maybe many people, are going to be radicalized, many Palestinians, young Palestinians in particular, and particularly the poor, and particularly the refugees. I think that I'll try and look in a crystal ball and say that there is a serious risk of inroads by ISIS, Daesh, as it's called in Arabic, and Al-Qaeda, especially among refugees, that they're already recruiting in the refugee camps. And I think that there is a serious prospect, arms are already being stored away secretly, of violence against the old Palestinian leadership and against Israeli targets, which could mutate and take new forms in the coming years. And Abbas and the others around him are aware of this. They're desperate to keep the show on the road and try and pacify their rather sullen population. I think a few words about Gaza and Hamas are probably in order also, because I've lived there. I lived in Gaza for 3.5 years before I moved to New York with the UN, with UNRWA. And I have a good sense of what ordinary Gazans think, and it's very different from what it's portrayed as by outsiders. So 15 years after Hamas first won local and then national elections, it still has a following. It's a minority following, but despite its failings and its high-handedness and its inability to be able to break out of the trap that it's in, I think it still has a certain constituency, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. And I think in free and fair elections, it would probably get a pretty good showing. In fact, it's even possible that Ismail Haniyeh, its leader, could beat Abbas in a fair vote. And that brings me to the upcoming series of 3 Palestinian elections, which have been scheduled by Abbas for the coming months. Whether these actually go ahead or not is, I think, still in the balance. There has been good progress and in the negotiations among the parties to try to sort out the technical aspects of it, the political system that will be used, the monitoring, the election court, etc. So far at least, it's going reasonably well, but it's starting to run into some hurdles. The biggest is clearly the fact that Israel does not want these elections to go ahead with Hamas taking part. And I would strongly suspect that Washington doesn't either, because it presents them with a potentially major headache of what to do if Hamas manages to share power in future with Fatah in a new Palestinian government. that has been legitimized democratically. It'll be very hard for the Biden administration to actually speak out against it, given that it's committed to taking a more values-based and human rights-based approach towards foreign policy than the Trump administration's transactional policies, which was all about supporting Israel and the Zionist cause, did in the past. So there are three sets of elections. The first one in late May is for the Legislative Council, the Palestinian Legislative Council. If that goes smoothly, then there are two others, one for the presidency in late May and one for the Palestinian National Congress at the end of July. And that last one is really the most important and probably the least likely to happen. But if it does happen, that would be a real opportunity and moment for national renewal of the Palestinian movement, provided, and it's a big caveat, that new leaders are willing and able to come to the fore. And this is really my main thesis, is that the younger generation, which has been alienated, and particularly Palestinians in the diaspora, feel completely cut off from their own leadership and their own cause. And they're looking around for new ways in order to be able to make their voice heard and new vehicles to be able to do it with. Because as I've suggested, the PLO itself, which is an old-fashioned 1950s style movement, a secular movement, but one that is similar to the liberation movements that were found elsewhere in the Arab world and in the decolonization movements in Africa and Asia, really has not updated itself and modernized itself as it needs to do so. So what are my grounds for some very modest optimism? Most of it comes from the fact that there are young Palestinians who I've heard through many virtual talks that I've taken part in, partly through the elders, partly through other organizations, but listening to their voices directly, who are making common cause across the fragmented geographic realities of their lives. And, just pause and think about that for a moment. The reality for most Palestinians is that they live disconnected lives, whether it's in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, the 1948 Palestinians in Israel, in the West Bank, in the refugee camps, either in the region, particularly Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, or else are living abroad in the diaspora and have made their lives there. These are different realities living under different legal and political systems, but where their voice is having difficulty being heard a lot of the time. But the fact that they're using social media and virtual platforms that we've all had to get used to in the past year in order to try to discuss strategies and to think about new ways of working across these geographic boundaries is a source of encouragement to me. So instead of looking, as you might have expected, to the past, to the old parallels with apartheid South Africa and the role of the ANC and Nelson Mandela, which is what the older generation does, they're looking instead to Black Lives Matter and to other movements for social justice. There are Palestinian feminist movements being formed, and there is some common cause being made with young leftist, progressive, if you like, Jewish Israelis as well. And that is encouraging too. It's not such a bleak picture. It's a difficult picture politically in Israel, but there are some who are willing to be able to join them in new forms of struggle. What I'm also encouraged by, and I think should give us all cause for some heart, is the rise in recent years of liberal Jewish movements in the United States and in Europe, including in the UK, of people who want to stand against injustice and who are not so hung up on the traditional Israeli dilemma and angst that they have of being unable to being all three of the things that they really would like to be, which is a secure, democratic, and Jewish state. I mean, as the old mantra always goes, that Israel can have two of those, but not all three. It can be secure and democratic, it can be secure and Jewish, but it cannot be secure, democratic, and Jewish all at the same time. And it's dealing with that quandary, that dilemma, which has been the thing that Israeli leaders have been struggling with for so long. And one of the reasons why they pulled out of Gaza back in 2005, in order to be able to hive it off as a separate area, which did not affect their demographic calculations. I think there's also some grounds for a little bit of encouragement from the fact that Israeli practices in the Palestinian territories have been declared to amount to apartheid. This is important legally, and it's important in terms of social attitudes. Attitudes in Israel, who certainly hate that parallel. Attitudes among solidarity groups like yours, attitudes among people, international lawyers and international institutions who say that if indeed apartheid is being practiced, and there is a consensus among lawyers that this is the case, then certain consequences flow from that, because apartheid is defined in international law as a war crime. And there has to be accountability, something that has been missing in the Palestinian case for a very long time. Israel, as we all know, has been able to get off scot-free with undertaking actions that anywhere else in the world would get very severe sanctions, but it has not faced any consequences at all. But that definition that apartheid exists and is being practiced is alive and well in the occupied territories, I believe could change public attitudes in the UK and could in turn force governments to be able to take new forms of action. And it could possibly, but this is speculation on my part, actually provide for some forms of restraint on Israeli behavior in the Palestinian territories, particularly settlement building, even if it does not, in the end of the day, this declaration of apartheid advance the cause of a separate Palestinian state. So you might want me to address that big question that's hanging there in the balance of what are the prospects for a viable Palestinian state and what are the alternatives? The short answer, and I have to be honest with you, is that I have not believed that a real state, which according to the UN, and this I'm repeating the official language now, is a viable, contiguous and sovereign Palestinian state. I do not believe that the prospects of that being realized are there any longer. And I've believed that for some years now. This doesn't mean one shouldn't continue to keep trying for it. I think it is possible, but it's becoming increasingly unrealistic. And it's certainly very hard to imagine that there will be a major withdrawal of settlers from the West Bank or from East Jerusalem across the Green Line. Some alternatives are being thought about, and they're actually quite interesting alternatives. And I've heard these even from Israeli settlers living in the West Bank, who themselves sometimes come up with some novel ideas which may not have political traction, but at least they show some thinking that they can find some way of living with their Palestinian neighbors because of their attachment to the land and their sense of the religious importance of the land to them. The obvious alternatives to a real Palestinian state is either a single democratic state. I think that is asking a turkey to vote for Christmas. It's not going to happen. Certainly not in my lifetime, and maybe not in the lifetime of most of yours. Israel, particularly in its current very right-wing sentiment, where the population as a whole is becoming increasingly racist, is very unlikely to be able to decide that it will live in harmony with the Palestinian population on a basis of equality. The other alternatives, which are talked about, but remain also in the realm of theory, are a federation or a confederation of two separate independent states. My own favorite theory is that somewhere down the road, possibly in 50 years' time, we will go back to where we were at the time of the British Mandate and earlier, and we will actually have a confederation involving the entities of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, reuniting these territories, which logically belong together. But we're not there yet, and it's certainly not going to happen in the near future. So in the short term, I'd say that we have to consider that the Palestinian movement, as it has been known up until now, is reaching a fairly crucial moment of truth. But there are some possibilities of a renewal and some hope that in the future that the strong and really indomitable Palestinian spirit will be able to come through and will be able to find new ways of living with their Jewish neighbors. But Israel's not going away. There isn't going to be a Palestinian state in the near future. But Palestine and Palestinians remain a reality. The worst of all worlds would be the continuation of the status quo or the worsening of the status quo. And that is what I fear, that at least in the short term, that the Israeli government is likely to continue to do because of the fact that it will not face any significant pressure from those who are in a position to be able to put pressure on it, and that is the Arab world or the European Union, which is totally divided on the issue, or the UK government, and not the Biden administration. The Biden administration, I think, will regard this as conflict management and not conflict resolution. And I doubt that they are going to break out of the old paradigm and have any new thinking. There is some private new thinking going on in Europe, but whether it's going to be adopted as official policy, I very much doubt. So I see that I've been talking now for almost half an hour, and I think it's probably best that I stop and answer your questions and hear any comments that you might have.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I don't see any questions in the chat just now, but I have one or two myself to start a discussion going. I was interested in what you had to say about the involvement of young people in politics and in campaigning for the elections. And I also noticed, I'm not sure if you mentioned this because I dropped out for a couple of minutes, my internet went, that they've introduced some rather peculiar rules for the elections. And in particular, I'm thinking of the one which says that candidates have to be 28 years old to stand. Is this a deliberate attempt by Abbas to prevent any young politicians getting into the Legislative Council?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I conveyed the impression that young people want to participate in these elections, then perhaps I should correct that impression a little bit, John. I think young people are pleased that these elections are taking place. There is certainly a great deal of dismay, not only about those electoral rules that you refer to, but also about the way in which the party list system will give control to Fatah and Hamas to be able to dictate who the candidates are going to be, rather than having a first past the post system as happened in the past. So insofar as the party machines are going to remain in charge, that is the case. I mean, Abbas sees this as a fairly tightly run election with his own script, and there's been considerable intimidation of others, including the former foreign minister Nasser al-Qudwa, who's trying to run on an independent ticket, not to be able to run separately.
Okay. So I had heard some months ago that there were likely to be some other sort of nascent parties likely to put up candidates. Are you suggesting that for one reason or another this won't happen? and that it will be a straight fight between the PLO and Hamas?
I think it will. Fatah and Hamas, it'll be between rather than the PLO.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
But there will be small parties who will put up candidates, but the proportional vote system and the party list system that is being used will favor the bigger parties. And the smaller parties are unlikely to do very well. I think where the change might take place, if it goes ahead, is in the presidential election because of the unpopularity of Abbas himself. And so I think that if there was to be a credible alternative candidate to Abbas, and there are several waiting in the wings, then I think there could really be a difference. Now, many on this call probably are aware that Marwan Barghouti is considering a run, and people from Abbas's camp have been trying to dissuade him from doing so. I think it's almost certain that if he did run and he was allowed to do so, then he would be the most popular choice for president in the future, not only because of his martyr status, but also because he is seen as not corrupt like many of the old leaders are.
Many of the people on this call will know who Marwan Barghouti is, but some may not. Would you just like to?
Sure. Marwan Barghouti was the leader of a young Fatah group which did commit acts of violence, and he was sentenced to multiple life sentences in jail, and Israel has shown no inclination to be able to release him.
Okay. Belinda, I see you've got your hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I thought of a question, then there was something you said right at the end which made me have another question, so I'll just throw them both in and you can deal with them as you like. Very alarming, the data you gave from the polling about, you know, the third who want to take up arms, the third who want to leave, and the third who just see the PLO from an instrumental point of view. What sort of turnout would you think they'll get in the elections? I'm assuming it's an election where people choose to vote. It isn't sort of compulsory. So, you know, I can imagine people just not voting, get faced with what they're faced with. But the other thing you just, right at the end, you talked about some new thinking in Europe, that it wasn't becoming mainstream, but perhaps you could just flesh that out a bit.
Yeah, thank you, Belinda. Turnout is critically important, and I haven't seen any reliable indications of what it's likely to be. My personal guess is that the turnout could be relatively high. Palestinians are politically well attuned. They're people who really do feel and breathe politics on a daily basis, and they've been starved of the opportunity to have real votes. Apart from student elections, and now since 2006, since January 2006. But there's equally a huge degree of cynicism among many as to whether the elections really are going to be fair. I think that's a bit unjust, because I think the Central Elections Commission is a professional body and is likely to ensure that the rules that are agreed are respected. But I think that there is going to be cynicism over whether Abbas is serious. He has pulled the plug several times in the past on similar calling of elections, particularly over the issue of Jerusalemites. And I think this is worth pointing out here, that the participation of the roughly 225,000 Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem beyond the Green Line is of vital importance from a political point of view, because it would be a counter to the Trump administration's recognition of all of Jerusalem as being Israeli. And that in effect, you know, eroded or eliminated the Green Line that runs through Jerusalem. So having those people participate is important, because otherwise they're disenfranchised. And it also reaffirms the validity of the Green Line. But who's going to put pressure on Israel to allow that to happen? That is where foreign governments can make a difference. And that's really where I would like to see the Johnson government and the Biden administration in the States doing something serious to be able to live up to their principles about practicing democracy elsewhere and allow that to happen. But I'm sorry, I went off on a bit of a tangent there.
I see you've got your hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question? David?
Was that me?
Yes.
I've got a question that interests me personally. I'm not sure. I'd like to get your opinion of how significant the Israeli government's campaign on anti-Semitism has been for the Palestinians, and whether the rise of, for example, the Jewish Voice for Peace has any significance from the point of view of Palestinians. I mean, A, what do you know what Palestinians think of this? And B, do you think it has any importance for them?
The answer is a paradox. Like many others, I believe that Jewish Voices for Peace and other similar groups make a big difference. And anything that can be done to encourage them should be done to be able to do so, because their voices are important to be heard. The problem really is that the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs has deliberately and systematically conflated claims of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionist actions or criticisms of Israel and its actions in the Palestinian territories. You know, the phrase that is used, which I think is accurate, is that it has weaponized the charge of anti-Semitism in order to be able to muzzle criticism. And for that reason, I want to draw your attention to something that I learned about just today, which is really, for me, an encouraging development. And that is something called the Jerusalem Declaration, which has been issued today under the signatures of more than 200 prominent legal scholars, most of them Jewish, which challenges the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism because of the way in which it muzzles free speech and prevents criticism of Israel and its policies. And that is a very important intellectual rejoinder and a practical rejoinder as a guide to those who feel muzzled in their criticism. And being able to cite those really eminent names who have signed this, as I say, most of them Jewish themselves, is, I think, really valuable.
Yeah, I was going to ask you exactly about that declaration, which I interrupted my reading of it in order to log into this.
Well, I'm glad you've read it, because I think it's an important step forward, and I'm very pleased that they were able to get such good signatories.
Thank you, David. Coming back to the elections for a moment, there've been two different reactions to Hamas's involvement in this that I've heard discussed even just this morning. One is, concern about Hamas, being an anti-democratic and indeed violent organization. Also the reaction that, isn't it wonderful that Hamas is really seriously prepared to engage in the democratic process and possibly even share power with Fatah if if the election leads in that direction. And think of our own experience with Northern Ireland. I wonder whether those of us who are campaigning for Palestinian rights ought to ought to consider making much more of the Irish experience, and the fact that it took a long time for Sinn Féin to be brought into the democratic process. And look how well it's worked, relatively speaking, you know, and the way that sort of bitter enemies, they have managed to work together with a functioning government in Northern Ireland. Given that we caused all the problems in the first place in Palestine, could we not make much more of our own success in relative, of course, in Northern Ireland as an example for how to deal with a situation that they're in Palestine?
John, I know Hamas reasonably well. As a journalist working there for the FT, I was fortunate enough to have interviewed its founder, Sheikh Yassin, the day he was released from an Israeli jail after a long sentence and before he was assassinated by a drone strike from the air. And I've followed Hamas reasonably closely. And I think neither of those characterizations that you gave are fully accurate. Hamas internally is a highly democratic movement. And it's a movement which takes very seriously the development of democratic processes and of proper free internal elections. Whether one likes it or not, just as with other similar movements, it is a valid and legitimate part of the Palestinian political scene, and it should not, in my view, be shunned or marginalized, because that only will drive it underground and make things worse. And there are parallels with Northern Ireland here. But there are different wings inside Hamas and different views, some who are more pragmatic than others. At the time when Hamas won the January 2006 elections for the PLC and was able to form a government, it itself was surprised by that. They didn't expect to win it, and they found themselves thrust into a position that they were not prepared for. But many of its leaders at that time were, I hate to use the word moderate, but it's not very meaningful, but pragmatic people who had been educated in the UK. They're not Neanderthals. Thinking people, they're Islamists, yes. And so therefore, if you take a position on the role of political Islam to say it's not a valid political force, well, then you have to follow it through to its logical conclusion. I mean, the Egyptian government did that, and so did the UAE, the Emirati government, which wants to ban any expression of political Islam in political life. But recognizing that there has always been a religious strand to Palestinian nationalism, and that they have been kept out of the PLO, which is essentially a secular body up until now. Now, that is one of the larger issues, is the way in which the expressions of those who are sincere about their faith but want to be able to exercise democratic politics have been treated to double standards. I think we can all accept that. It was frankly shocking the way in which in 2007 that conniving foreign powers worked with Fatah to try to overthrow the democratic results. The fighting that took place in Gaza in mid-2007 was a preemptive action by Hamas against Fatah in order to prevent a coup against themselves. So in order to encourage the pragmatists, and I have some sense that it took lengthy deliberations internally before they decided that they would support the idea of elections, and it's not certain yet how they will participate or whether they want to be party to the government in future, or whether they will simply work behind the scenes by nominating people who are close to them or sympathetic to them. This is about coaxing Hamas into being more realistic and accepting that they have to take risks in order to try to help regenerate the larger body of Palestinian politics.
Okay. Adrian Litvinov, you had a question about the Israeli elections. Would you like to ask it? Need to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. Just been reading a little bit about the ebb and flow of Netanyahu's holdover power with this weekend's elections or last weekend's elections. And I wonder whether you think there's any possibility of progress given his personal lack of popularity and, of course, the legal difficulties in which he's deeply embedded at the moment.
I, like you, Adrian, followed the Israeli political scene, and it's very hard to be able to envisage how there is going to be a pathway towards a stable coalition government to be formed as a result of these elections. Very hard indeed. Yes, the vote is polarized against those who are for Bibi and those who are against Bibi. He still retains a strong core constituency, but there are quite a lot more people who are more to the right, who are more racist and who are more anti-democratic to his right, who have gained some significant support. At the same time, the Arab parties have lost ground from the last election, and that is a shame because they could have been a balancing factor. And in particular, the split in the Palestinian Arabs, the 1948 Palestinians, as they prefer to be called, between the secular and the Islamist groups. And the idea that Bibi should be courting the Palestinian Islamists is really a theater of the absurd, in my opinion. But he is indeed, and they've made themselves available to be courted to try to find a way in, but they will be used and they will be dropped as soon as they can be. Unfortunately, the election campaign made virtually no reference to the Palestinian issue. It did refer, in Bibi's opinion, to the Abraham Accords and his normalization of relations with the Arab states, several Arab states, as proof that one doesn't need to deal with the Palestinians to bypass them. So the issue of what's going to happen on the Palestinian issue, of how to address this challenge, has been ducked. And I don't see any serious constituency apart from a small number of good people in the Meretz left-wing party and some in the Arab list who don't count as far as coalition building are concerned, who are actually going to champion it. So they were absent by default almost.
Andy Smith, you had a question.
Thanks, John. Yeah, it's naive, really, but I think I'm right in saying that most Israelis, other than when they've been serving in the occupied territories in the IDF, don't really have much exposure to occupied Palestine in the sense of 67 and after territories. I'm just thinking, you know, people to people, civil society linkages. You mentioned, Andrew, some young leftist Israeli groups that are a bit more sort of sympathetic. I'm just wondering what the chances are of any sort of grassroots movement to try and foster a bit more understanding, a bit less demonization of the other.
Andy, it's not naive, and it's a good question, which gives me the opportunity to draw on the fact that I'm relatively old and, as I said, have been following this issue for 35 years. Because when I first went to Israel and Palestine, and I was living in Jerusalem, there was a huge amount of interaction at all levels, through business, through work by Palestinians, through solidarity associations between Palestinian and Israeli professional groups and trades unions, through politics, a great deal of social interaction that went on every single day. That's changed out of recognition, completely out of recognition, and it's a consequence of the Second Intifada and the building of the separation barrier, which has literally and metaphorically represented that turning of the backs of the two peoples on each other and the demonization of the other and the treating of the other as numbers and not as people. That's the real heart of the problem. And each side is entrenched in its own self-righteousness and its own views about what needs to be done. And there is no dialogue any longer. And one of the big problems, and it's one that pains me, is that there is a very strong tendency among Palestinian activists in particular not to normalize, as they see it, relations with Israelis, even Israelis who are on their side, even Israelis who stand up and face opprobrium at home because they are defending Palestinian rights. You will find that Palestinian activists shun them. They will not have anything to do with them. So there are good, wonderful people on the Israeli side who would love to be able to find ways of making common cause with like-minded people on the other side, but they're not listening on the other side, and they don't want to hear, because they think that that is somehow going to be doing the work of those who want them to give up on their resistance. It's not something that I personally think is a very sensible course of action, but it exists. And in meetings that I've organized for the Balfour Project, for example, which I'm a trustee, I found that young activists who were perfectly happy to talk to me personally in Jerusalem and explain their plight were unwilling to be able to participate in a virtual meeting organized by the Balfour Project about Palestinian rights if there was an Israeli on the virtual platform with them. It's so self-defeating in my view.
Can I,
You want to come back on that, Andy?
just inspired by that, I'm suspecting from what you said there that you wouldn't, what's your view on BDS? And yeah.
Okay, I haven't mentioned it yet. My views are changing. Give me a little bit of credit for not being too stuck in my views. One of the problems with BDS is that it's very fuzzy as to what its goals are. And it brings in many fellow travelers. So there are some who would see their goal as the destruction of Israel. And there are some at the opposite end who see their goal as simply upholding the sanctity of international law and the green line of differentiation between the occupied territories and Israel proper. And there's lots of people in different parts in the middle. So therefore, for people who, like me, wish to stand up for international law and established procedures, there is a danger of being associated with it because you can be tarred with something which is unfair. That said, I think that BDS is a perfectly legitimate and effective tool of protest, of opposition, of as a means of being able to change cost-benefit calculations in Israel, because at the end of the day, I think that's what needs to be done. And I would argue that the things that will really change Israeli public opinion, and Israel is, as we all know, a very democratic country that public opinion matters, would be the use of techniques such as were used in South Africa of a sporting or a cultural boycott. That would hurt. That would really affect Israeli public opinion and force a recalculations in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv on what they ought to be doing. So that would be the direction. And so I bring that in as a connection to BDS, because I think that different forms of showing protest in a non-violent way about Israeli actions and of stigmatizing a country that thinks it can get away and have its cake and eat it, it is really the only way to go if one is going to bring about change in the absence of any real pressure from governments who are unfortunately muzzled for different reasons.
So do you think that having a ban on settlement trade would therefore be of rather limited effect?
I think
that's easier to sell.
It's easier from a it's a more practical step, John. So a ban on settlement goods, is definitely something that should be a goal of those who want to uphold the differentiation between the occupied territories, what's intended for the Palestinian state and otherwise. I would go further and argue for visas for settlers. People who live in the settlements ought not to be treated as if they're Israelis living in Israel proper when it comes to entry to the European Union, for example.
Yeah, okay. Jane Knight, you had a question in the chat quite early on. Would you like to ask that?
Yeah, okay. It distresses me that the world doesn't care very much about Palestine or at all. I mean, we all know about the Uyghurs and the people in Bangladesh and the refugees. There's so many terrible things going on in the world, but Palestine seems to just get forgotten. And for someone like myself and others in this group who went out to see for ourselves what it was like, it was a terrible shock to find out the daily cruelty that people are living under. And it never fails to grieve me thinking about it. But the impotence that one feels, I mean, I think your talk tonight's been fantastically interesting and very encouraging. There's slight glimmers here and there, but it is only tiny glimmers. And I just feel it's getting worse by the day and there's a certain urgency. And I've just wanted to really just let you know how have an outflow of emotion. It's not going to go anywhere, but I just feel totally impotent at times. So it's great that people like you around who are bit by bit trying to make a change. And I wish there was something we could do that's meaningful, but all we do is talk about it when we get the chance and listen to people like you again when you come up. I'm just expressing a lot of frustration. I'm sorry.
Jane, there's no need to apologize whatsoever. I share and understand your frustration and your sentiments, and I'm very glad that you went out to see for yourself, because that really is what changes people's minds. And being able to then pass on that personal testimony, that eyewitness accounts to others, and start changing people's minds, because the big problem for me is the entrenched narratives. There are very settled narratives in this country, and people unwilling to be able to listen to the other side. And the Palestinian side of the story does not get told very well. And the government's view and the view of a lot of the mainstream media, is that this is not a news story. It's not something that's particularly interesting. And that's partly because of that sense of underlying hopelessness about the situation in the face of leaders on both sides who are not doing the right thing in terms of trying to resolve this issue. They're, at least on the Israeli side, just pushing the problem just down the road. But you have all my sympathy for being frustrated.
There was a question from Roy Little I saw in the chat asking about rockets landing in Israel. Is this still a problem? Are there still rockets?
Yes, from time to time there are. They are usually not fired by Hamas, which is a pretty disciplined organization, but by Islamic Jihad. They're expressions of frustration and of defiance. I don't justify them. I have a human rights background, and I think that the indiscriminate use of weapons is to be condemned out of hand by all sides. And firing these unguided missiles at a civilian population to terrorize them, is a war crime just as much as the Israeli practices are too. So yes, from time to time, it does happen. They're homemade rockets. Some of them have a certain degree of accuracy with more guided warheads on them. They very rarely cause any significant damage, but they should not happen. This said, I should just state my own beliefs, which is that under international law, resistance to occupation is justified. We all know that the French resistance, the underground, the Maquis, was totally justified. Their moral side against the Germans during the Second World War and the German occupation. There's no difference. It is a morally justified actions, but attacks on civilians are not justified. And there we have to draw a distinction. And so use of rockets is not something that I can ever condone.
And of course, what not everybody has noticed with the recent decision of the International Criminal Court is that they're likely to investigate both
sides. Absolutely, indeed.
Yeah. Well, it's well past 7 o'clock now, and we said we would make this an hour, so we should probably start to draw to a close. Before we do so, Linda, would you like to give us some information about the upcoming meetings that Justice for Palestinians has got?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I mean, we always try to set a very high standard of the speakers we have, and tonight I think we've set another high bar, which will be a challenge for us all to meet. But we hope to resume the monthly vigil against the occupation inspired by Women in Black from West Jerusalem on the 17th of April. I was in touch a few weeks ago with the local police force to check that we could do it. They thought we probably could, but I'll confirm that again. We'll put that out in mailings and also on Facebook. The next confirmed speaker is the 10th of June, and we're delighted that we have Chris Doyle, who's going to be talking about Palestinian elections. Now, we had hoped to have on Nakba Day a screening of a film called The Present, which you may have heard of. There were two films called The Present if you Google. There's one sort of animated one of about 4 minutes, but this is a film of about 24 minutes by a Palestinian British director called Farah Nabulsi. Some of us have already seen the film through Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and others. And she agreed to let us do the screening and to do a Q&A. However, things have changed. I mean, I'm delighted that she's been shortlisted now for an Oscar. The chances of a Palestinian film getting an Oscar probably aren't high, but it's getting a lot of exposure, on the back of which Netflix are now showing the film, and you can also see it on Vimeo on demand. As I understand it, and I just had this confirmed yesterday, this makes it difficult for her at this stage to let us just screen it. So we hope that we can either do a physical screening later in the year or do a Q&A with Farah at some point about making films about Palestine and marketing them. But just wanted to tell you about that. And if you have access to Netflix or you can use Vimeo on demand, there's a small fee for seeing it. Please do see that film. It really is worth doing. Andy and I are also exploring some other speakers, but we'll let you know once it's a bit more confirmed. We've sent out feelers and we're just waiting for a response on that. And as ever, we're delighted to have suggestions on speakers and things we should be doing. We'll continue to publicise also events that Medical Aid for Palestinians is organising, particularly their excellent cookery lessons. The one this Sunday is with, I've forgotten her name now, but she wrote a book about food in Gaza. I heard her speaking in Jerusalem 2 years ago, and I think it'll be fascinating, quite apart from the food, but just to hear about nutrition in Gaza and just how much more difficult it's become. Again, we put in the chat our Facebook page. Please have a look at it, like it and share it. And also, if you'd like to be on our mailing list, we send out about a monthly mailing with things we're doing and links you might want to know about. Please do contact us through Justice of Palestinians at Leamington Spa. Thank you.
And perhaps it's worth saying self-evidently the Peace Festival isn't going to be taking place this year at the mid-June time when that usually happens, and where we usually have an exhibition stand and a public meeting, comes just before the theoretical date for the end of the total end of lockdown. So
yeah, EcoFest will go ahead, we think, in September. Whether we can sort of feed a Zaytun Palestinian ecological food element into that, we can think about.
Very good. Okay, well, thank you, Belinda, and thank you, Andrew, very much indeed. Obviously, I think it's clear from the questions and so on that everybody has been very interested in what you've had to say and really enjoyed your talk. So thank you very much for spending part of your Friday evening with us too.
Thank you for the invitation once again. I really enjoyed it, and I'm really very pleased to see such a group of people concerned, interested, passionate people on this subject. So thank you, and keep up the good work.
And probably about 2/3 of those on the call tonight have actually been to Palestine, actually.
Great.
So, very good.
All right.
Thank you all, and thank you all for joining. Good night.
That was terrific. I just wish there were more people watching, but yeah.
Yes, indeed, it was a disappointing turnout, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, just
we had about 20, I think.
Yeah, 20 plus, because some of them are couples. Relatively few from here, and even fewer from the active group. I mean, we drummed up some former ecumenical accompaniers.
By the way, I've just seen another film